I have been looking forward to doing this video for you for a minute. For anyone wanting a Dolby Atmos surround sound system that gets as close as possible to a full-on receiver and speakers, I have two favorites. And today, we're gonna pit them against each other. Let's go. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Caleb Denison, and today's video is all about comparing a top-tier and top-price Sonos surround system to the Sony Bravia Theater Quad. Here's what we've got. On the Sonos side, we have the Arc Ultra with its enhanced bass performance, the new Sonos Sub 4 with a Sub 3 on hand so we can play around with dual subwoofers, and two Dolby Atmos capable Era 300 speakers holding down the surround duties. On the Sony side, we have the Bravia Theater Quad system matched up to Sony's best subwoofer right now, the SW5. Now let's break down the system costs. This is where things get a little tricky because you can still buy a system bundle with the original Sonos Arc and the Sonos Sub 3, and in the context of this full system setup, you're going to get pretty similar results to a system that includes the more expensive Arc Ultra and Sub 4 that we have here today. More on that in a moment. I'm going to say that the Sonos system has a price range of about $2,200 to $2,500. The Sony Bravia Theater Quad with the SW5 subwoofer, which is not only the better setup from Sony, but also the more competitive setup for this comparison, that comes in at between $2,400 and $2,800, depending on who you buy it from and whether it's on sale at the time. Like Walmart has it for $2,400 right now, while Amazon has it for $2,800. Regardless, you're looking at comparably priced systems, okay? Depending on the deal that you get, you're looking at an average of $200 difference between the two. Now, you can tell just by looking that these systems approach making sound in different ways. The Sonos system uses a soundbar as its anchor, and in this Arc Ultra soundbar, you're getting 14 drivers. That's 7 tweeters, 6 mid-range drivers, and a dedicated subwoofer built right in for what Sonos calls a 9.1.4 audio experience from just the soundbar alone. And on its own, the Arc Ultra is a pretty formidable soundbar. I would argue the best standalone soundbar that you can buy without going into crazy expensive territory like with the high-end Sennheiser Ambio. But we aren't judging the Arc Ultra on its own. In fact, I feel like I need to repeat that. This is not a review of the Arc Ultra itself. So while its standalone bass performance is impressive, most of the bass in this system is going to be handled by the Sub 4, which uses two 5x8 elliptical drivers in a sealed cabinet designed to cancel out distortion and resonance. I also happen to think that it looks pretty great. The Era 300 speakers have 4 tweeters. One fires out from the front, one firing out of each side, and one firing out of the top. The woofers are both side-firing. Sonos doesn't disclose the driver sizes, by the way, though you could estimate by peeking. I will not be doing that because I can't verify it, and I'll not have anyone repeating potentially inaccurate information. So you're on your own there. I'm sorry. The Sony system takes a different approach. You get 4 low-profile square speakers that are easy to mount on the wall, either flush or on a conventional articulating wall mount. In each of these square speakers, you get a 3-way forward-firing speaker array with a 3/4 inch tweeter on top, a 2 3/8 mid-bass driver, and a 3 3/8 inch woofer. And out of the top of the speaker fires a 3 1/8 inch driver. So a pretty sizable Atmos driver. Also, I don't know if this matters to you, but the Sonos gear is available in black or white, while the Quad system comes only in this, well, gray color. Now, both of these systems have pretty advanced auto calibration and setup systems. Sonos calls its process TruePlay, while Sony doesn't really name its calibration process itself, but it calls the processing that it uses 360 spatial sound mapping technology. The objective in both cases is that once you run the app-based calibration processes, Not only do you get a custom EQ for the speakers unique to your room, but you also get optimized channel levels and spatial audio sound processing to help increase the surround sound effect. Both claim to offer some flexibility in where you place your speakers, but as I'll soon detail, the Sony Bravia Theater Quad delivers a more convincing Atmos presentation across an array of different potential speaker placement options. Now, let's talk about how you get sound out of these systems. And this is important because this is where we start to see some pretty significant differences and limitations that I think you should be aware of. Both the Sonos system and the Theater Quad have HDMI eARC inputs, meaning you can send audio from your TV's eARC or just plain ARC port out to either one. One major difference is that the Theater Quad from Sony has an extra HDMI input. So if you have a device that you want to connect directly to the Quad system without running it through your TV, you can do that. For wireless audio, the Bravia Theater Quad supports Bluetooth 5.2, Apple AirPlay 2, and Spotify Connect. It also supports Sony's own LDAC codec. So if you happen to have a mobile device that also supports LDAC, you can send high-res audio to the Theater Quad that way. So basically, if you're an Apple user, you're gonna use AirPlay. And if you're on Android, you're using Bluetooth, unless you happen to be using Spotify, in which case you can stream directly from Spotify via Wi-Fi. The Bravia Theater Quad does not support Chromecast audio. The Sonos system supports all the same wireless options, except it has Bluetooth 5.3, but it doesn't do Sony's LDAC for what that's worth. For movie soundtracks and TV, the Bravia Theater Quad has a slight advantage in that it supports advanced DTS formats like DTS-X, DTS Master Audio, and DTS HD High Resolution Audio. The Sonos system does not. Where things get really interesting and frustrating for me is how Sonos decides to handle music depending on whether it comes in through the HDMI port versus it coming in wirelessly. See, Sonos has this stance, apparently, where it assumes that anything coming in through the HDMI port is video related. And so, presuming that it's all video content, it doesn't allow you to do much with the surround speakers if you're feeding it a stereo audio signal via HDMI. Now, that's fine if it's a stereo TV signal, but for stereo music, I'd like to be able to use the surround speakers however I want. Like I can if I'm sending the Sonos system stereo music via AirPlay. Wireless music lets you get a full surround speaker effect, whereas on video, they are locked into this ambient option. And I find that frustrating because frankly, I do a lot of music listening with my Apple TV and sometimes even with YouTube or YouTube Music from the television apps. And I just hate having my hands tied like that. On the other hand, the Sony Bravia Theater Quad takes just one approach to using the surround speakers for stereo music, and that is to enhance the overall sound stage. You can turn them up and down in volume, but what comes out of the speakers is not at all adjustable. Sony has its way of doing things, and that's what it does. Now, it just so happens to be that I like what it's doing with stereo signals very much, but if I'm going to come down on Sonos for restricting options in some cases, I feel like I should point that out with the Sony as well. By the way, shout out to Andrew Robinson for checking my work on the Sonos system because I was confounded when I first ran into this issue of Sonos treating wireless stereo audio differently than HDMI stereo audio. I mean, it's a highly specific thing, and we did some troubleshooting together, and thank you, Andrew. And as long as I'm acknowledging Andrew, I should point out that he and I have some different takeaways coming up. Anyway, as for surround audio, be it Atmos music or TV or movie soundtracks, both systems do what they're told to do by the content, so no issues there, save the lack of more advanced DTS support on the Sonos system. Now, let's get to the fun part, the sound experience comparison. And to do that, I'm going to start with music. And I should tell you that music performance is a pretty big priority of mine. And I like to imagine that it is for a lot of others who are seeking to get a system that can deliver an experience as close to possible as a full-on component system. Given the Sonos' weird treatment of stereo audio via HDMI, I did most of my music playback via AirPlay 2 using my iPhone 16 Pro Max on both systems though, because I could. I also used an Apple TV through various TVs on my test bench for both stereo and Atmos music playback. I also used primarily Apple Music, though I did use some Tidal content. And for the most part, I did not use Sonos' app for streaming music because it just wasn't necessary and because it was super easy for me to bounce back and forth between the two systems using AirPlay from the Apple Music app, as you see here. Now, I need to take you through my process here because it has a lot to do with the experience I ended up having. What I mean is, I spent months listening to the Bravia Theater Quad before I ever got the Sonos system. So I built up a lot of experience with the Quad. When it was time to install the Sonos system and get it up and running, I spent a good amount of time playing around with placement of the Era 300s. I spent a long time figuring out that weird music playback issue that I can't seem to let go of. And then I spent a bunch of time just listening to the Sonos system, much of which was associated with a TV evaluation that I was working on. Point is, by the time I had really broken the Sonos system in and gotten some solid experience with it, it had been almost 2 months since I had listened to the Quad. Now, I'll come back to that. What I first noticed while listening to music with the Sonos system was how well integrated the Sub 4 was with the Arc Ultra and the Era 300s. It was damn near seamless. In my opinion, the best subwoofer experiences are ones where you don't know where the sub is and it never calls attention to itself. You just get the experience of full, deep, punchy bass. And that's exactly what I got with the Sonos system. I feel like Sonos is keeping the crossover point between the soundbar and satellites and the subwoofer low enough that the subwoofer doesn't have to play too high up into the frequency range, such that it's putting out directional sound and giving away its location. And for me, here in this studio, where I often end up putting the subwoofer in the back of the room somewhere, often closer to me than when it is at the front of the room, the subwoofer not identifying itself sonically is a really big deal to me. Another thing I noticed about the Sonos system was how, regardless of whether the Era 300s were set to full or ambient in the app, they didn't just fill out the back of the room with sound. We're still talking stereo music here, by the way, but they also enhanced the width of the front soundstage. For example, on this one Sonny Stitt record that I listened to, Stitt's sax is positioned toward the left side of the room. It's a pretty open sounding recording, and I heard him well outside of the edge of the soundbar. Now, on the Arc Ultra alone, the stereo separation isn't really anything to be excited about, but with the Era 300s playing in concert with the soundbar, you can get some really amazing instrumental placement around the room. And this is from a stereo source. It's not surround, right? There was even an impressive amount of height to the soundstage up front. I mean, it's really enjoyable, even for an at times hardcore 2-channel purist like myself. I had a great time listening to music on the Sonos system. But then, well, then I turned on the Bravia Theater Quad again, and well, that just shifted my entire perspective. It suddenly became apparent to me that by comparison, the Sonos system sounded, well, pretty thin. Now back to the Quad. The Bravia Theater Quad brought a sense of warmth and richness that was sorely missing from the Sonos system. Also, crazy as it may sound, but the two separate quad front speakers had way better center imaging than the Sonos system, even with the Arc Ultra actually positioned dead center in the room. I'm telling you, the Theater Quad's ability to put out a phantom center channel is unmatched, even by soundbars with an actual center speaker. And so in a stereo presentation, you get really pinpoint center imaging. Now, it's really important for you to hear this. Some of this disparity between the two systems turned out to be due to Sonos's TruePlay, which for the first time since I've been testing Sonos products, did more harm to the audio fidelity than good. I'm still baffled by that, but that's the experience I got in this room. Your mileage will vary. Still, even with TruePlay disabled and the Sonos system sounding a bit better, guys, the difference in musicality between the Sonos system and the Theater Quad, it's just not even close for me. The Theater Quad just sounds more realistic, tactile, full-bodied, like much closer to what I want from an audio system than what the Sonos ever put out for me. Now, I will admit that the Sony subwoofer doesn't integrate quite as seamlessly with the quad speakers as the Sonos Sub 4 does with its Sonos counterparts. It's not as if the Theater Quad was better at absolutely every notable aspect of the music performance, but on balance, it's no question that if I'm forced to buy one system or the other, I'm getting the Quad every time. But that's because music playback is super important to me, even more important than surround soundtrack performance. As for the differences between the two for Atmos music, well, from an Atmos surround effect perspective, it was negligible. I will say the Sonos jumped up in overall fidelity since the surround speakers were being used closer to their full potential. I'm telling you, the Era 300s in a stereo setup sound way better than they do as surround speakers. But in the end, even with Atmos music, the Quad won me over. Now, before we move on from music, I think it's important to point out that the Sonos system, well, the whole Sonos ecosystem, is designed to offer a much more comprehensive whole home music listening solution. You can add Sonos speakers to multiple rooms, tie them all together, use some of them or all of them. Like, there's no doubt that Sonos products are more versatile from that perspective. Also, they have built-in voice control, if that's your thing. But if we're talking about serving one room, providing home entertainment for a single space, from a music playback perspective, the Quad wins. Okay, so how about movie and TV watching? Well, there, the differences in fidelity are less stark, and some of the tricks that Sonos pulls off with its processing start making it a more compelling choice. Like, if I were using this Sonos system almost exclusively for movies and TV, and I was interested in having speakers elsewhere in my home, no question, Sonos is the way to go. It does awesome at all kinds of surround formats from all kinds of sources, streaming, DVD, Blu-ray, 4K Blu-ray, you name it. Also, the Sonos system will allow for dual subwoofers. Now, I know that it's not a super popular thing for most folks to have two subwoofers, but I gotta say, the bass went from excellent to awesome when I added the Sub 3 into the mix. It was more effortless and more even throughout the room, which is a benefit of having subwoofers in multiple locations. But even with just the one Sub 4, the Sonos system had superior bass output for movies and TV. Sony's SW5 is not a slouchy sub, but Sonos' subs are just next level. In my room, they were tighter, faster, and just more pleasant to listen to. With that said, I know that some folks will like the beefier or woofier approach that Sony's sub takes. And frankly, if you're in anything other than a cavernous, open space, I think the SW5 is going to do you just fine. Something else I think is really important to consider is that I gotta say, the Bravia Theater Quad is much more forgiving with speaker placement. If you have to put your surround speakers at different heights or at different distances from your seating position, if you need to put one front speaker closer to the TV than the other, Sony's spatial sound mapping tech is the truth. And it's gonna give you a more consistently excellent sound experience, stereo or surround, than the Sonos will. When I was testing the Theater Quad speakers, I sometimes needed to place the surrounds under objects like this shelf or these stairs, and yet I still got a sense of Atmos effect. And I should point out that this space is really hard for Atmos because there's very little sound that can be reflected off my high sound-treated ceilings. And perhaps that's why the Atmos dome effect that I got from the Theater Quad tended to be superior more often than not. it seems to rely a little less on ceiling reflected sound. On the other hand, I will say that the Sonos system was consistently more contiguous with its front to back motion on the horizontal axis, which I owe to the side-firing drivers in the Era 300 speakers. As for dialogue clarity and intelligibility, they're both great. I'm still marveling over the Theater Quad's ability to pull off a Phantom Center. So, if your situation is home theater is your priority, and you can put the speakers in their ideal positions, and you don't care much about multi-room audio stuff that the Sonos can offer, well, it's gonna be really hard to decide between the two. They're both excellent, and I think which you prefer is going to end up coming down to very individual taste. If you do have multi-room audio ambitions though, the Sonos is the obvious choice. But if you are a big-time music listener and a little snobby about the audio fidelity, or if you need to put your speakers in unconventional spaces, the Bravia Theater Quad is the clear choice. And in the end, it's the system that I'm going to use the most here in the studio when I'm not listening to conventional speakers like the Golden Ear T66 or the SVS Ultra Evolution Pinnacle, which I personally need for any vinyl listening that I'm going to do. But that, my friends, is a different video. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Did you find my comparison between these two systems helpful? Please let me know down in the comments. I'm always striving to help as many folks with real concerns as possible, so let me know how I did. Please consider liking and subscribing. This channel needs your support to grow and do better and better content. Thank you so much. I'll see you on the next one, and until then, here's 2 other videos I think you might like. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go.